Buddhism, why mastering causality is truly revolutionary. They tell us that the heart of the Buddha's awakening was discovering the principle of causality, how cause and effect work to shape your experience. It sounds pretty abstract, but it's actually directly related to what you're experiencing right now. In other words, there's the result of past Kamma, there's your present Kamma, and there's the result of present Kamma. Those are the three things you're experiencing at any given moment. Of course, when we start out, it all tends to be mixed together. It's just experience. We don't see these patterns. We don't see the component factors as separate and distinct, so things seem pretty random. But if you learn how to look at what you're doing right now, you come to see that you're not totally passive. The things you're experiencing are not just coming in at you. There's an active side to the mind that goes out and shapes them, adds a little here, takes away a little bit there. You're getting sensitive to that aspect of the mind, to what you're doing right now. That's a large part of the insight you need to gain in the meditation. Most of us are like a man who goes storming into a room, acting in an offensive way, and then later complains, "The people in the room seemed awfully defensive, awfully unfriendly," as if he didn't have any impact on the atmosphere of the room through his actions, through the way he entered the room. So how are you storming into the present moment? One way to find out is by checking on the breath. Exactly what are you doing with the breath right now? Is the breathing a totally passive, automatic process, or are you doing something to the breath? Is there some level of the mind that's making decisions? One way to find out is to make conscious decisions about the breath, nudging it a little bit here, a little bit there. We're not talking about making huge differences in the breath, just making gradual changes in whichever direction seems most comfortable. As you do this, you begin to realize that your present experience of pleasure or pain depends on decisions you're making right now. You begin to get more sensitive to what the mind is doing, particularly in terms of its perceptions and thought fabrications, and how these relate to your feelings. Perceptions are the labels you put on things. For example, you may experience the body as something solid breathing in and breathing out. Well, you can change that perception. See everything you sense in the body right now as an aspect of the breath property. Look at it that way. Every sensation as a type of breath sensation. See what that does to your sensation of the body, the way you relate to it, the way you evaluate it, the way you breathe. And then your thought fabrications. Use them to ask questions. How about breathing this way? How about breathing that way? And so you give it a try. As you do this, you get a greater and greater sense of how much you really are shaping your present experience. Then you can take this insight and apply it to issues of pain, both physical pain and mental pain. Most of us tend to think of ourselves as passive recipients, victims of a particular pain attacking us. There doesn't seem much we can do about it. That's because we have a habitual way of reacting to pain. Unless we can change that habit, we're not going to see much improvement in the issue of why we're suffering, of how we suffer. But if you really look at a physical pain, you realize that while part of it comes from something wrong with the body, another part comes from what the mind is doing to manage the experience of pain. The way it paints a mental picture of the pain, the way it latches on to that mental picture, what it's doing to maintain the pain in a particular way or to move it in a particular direction. That's going on all the time, yet we're not really aware of how much we're contributing to our own pain. That's the big issue. That's the first noble truth. The pain we're creating through our clinging, craving, and ignorance. To see these things, you have to be very, very sensitive to the present moment and very sensitive to what your input is. This is why concentration is so important, getting the mind really still so that it can see these things very precisely. For instance, When pain arises, we tend to miss the fact that the mind is constantly labeling it pain, 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 pain. And in addition to the label of pain, we sometimes paint a picture of it to ourselves. That act of labeling, if there's clinging along with it, contributes to the pain. And when you get really sensitive to the movements of the mind, and this requires getting the breath really still so that it's not interfering with what you're seeing, you see that there's a constant repetition going on in the mind. Sometimes the labeling, the clinging, and the repetition are so insistent that the physical cause of the pain has long since gone. The act of clinging is the actual pain you're experiencing now. So when you learn how to see, oh, there's that mental label going again, there it goes again, there it goes again. Can you stop it? See what happens when you stop it, when you just drop it. You'll find that your experience of the pain changes. That's when you gain insight into the issue of what you're doing in the present moment, how you contribute to the shape of your experience. That's a lot of the meditation right there, just sensitizing the mind to what it's doing. Most often that's our big blind spot, what we're doing right now. We're so conscious of what other people are doing. They did this to me, they did that to me. But we're not looking at what we're doing, which is why what they're doing causes us pain. Many times you can't avoid what's coming at you from the outside. It's past Kamma, but you can avoid the unskillful ways you're reacting to it. Sometimes you find that the way you're reacting to the situation feeds back into the situation, influencing what those other people are doing and making the situation worse. But even when that's not the case, you find that your suffering really comes from the way you relate to the outside situation. That's what the first noble truth is all about, clinging to the 5 aggregates, clinging to the form of the body, clinging to your feelings, perceptions, thought fabrications, or consciousness. When you stop clinging to these aggregates, then even though they're still impermanent and there still may be some stress in them, it doesn't weigh on the mind. The bridge has been cut so that it doesn't connect. You stop lifting things up, as in Ajahn Suwat's image. The mountain may be heavy in and of itself, but if you're not trying to lift it up, then it's not heavy for you. So you've got to see where you're doing your heavy lifting and then try to understand why. Only when you understand why you're doing things can you really stop. Sometimes in the course of a meditation you can force yourself to stop, but if there's no real understanding, then as soon as the mind gets back to its old ways, it goes lifting things, picking them up, carrying them around again. But if you look into why you're lifting these things, what misunderstandings lie behind what you're doing, why you feel that you have to carry these things around, that's a lot of the insight right there. It's an old habit, the way the mind contributes to things in the present moment, particularly the ways it causes itself unnecessary suffering. We think that an undercurrent of suffering is a necessary part of experience, but it's not. When you see it as stress, when you see it as a burden and you realize that it's not necessary, that's when you really let go. So check on exactly where your clinging is right now, where you're contributing to unnecessary suffering. Try to make the mind as still as possible and then stay there to observe. Is there still some stress here? Is there still a sense of burdensomeness here? What else is going along with that? Can you see any activity, any intention that's going along with that stress? And if you catch sight of that activity, that intention, you drop it. It's almost invariably something you didn't realize you were doing, something you were holding on to, in the sense of repeating it mindlessly. Sometimes you're aware that you're holding on to the act of intention, but you think you've got to hold on. This is the core of my being. This is who I am. This is the way my mind has to work. Well, it doesn't have to work that way. Learn how to question those assumptions. Learn how to let go a little bit. This loosens things up in the mind. The things you never saw before, now you suddenly see. This burden you create for yourself is totally unnecessary. What you thought was necessary, the way things had to be, they don't have to be that way at all. That's the whole message of the Buddha's awakening, the principle of causality we've been talking about. He applied it to see how the suffering the mind experiences in the present moment is not necessary. That's why the principle of causality was so important. He realized the input he was putting into the present moment that was creating the suffering, and he learned to stop. And what happened when there was no input in the present moment? As we meditate, we find that our input gets more and more and more subtle. Oftentimes, we're not even aware of any input. We tell ourselves that we're sitting here perfectly peaceful, perfectly calm, nothing's going on, but actually, there's a lot going on in the mind that we're missing. It's in a blind spot. When you begin to see that blind spot, begin to let go of what's in there. That's when things open up. That's when the meditation can really start making a radical change in the mind. A lot of the relationships in your mind, where you thought this is that way and that's this way, you begin to realize are not necessarily so. And the realization that they're not necessary, that's where the liberation lies. So, a continuity runs throughout the whole process of meditation from the very beginning. If, while you're sitting here, the mind slips off, just bring it right back. If it slips off again, just bring it right back again. Even this much can make you more conscious of what you're doing in the present moment. You get more conscious of how the mind has its blind spots, and you learn to make them more and more and more subtle, less dominant in the mind. In other words, you try to cut through them as much as you can. What happens, of course, is that they find more subtle ways to hide, but at least you gain a measure of control over the mind and a greater sense of what you're doing in the present moment. That's crucial to the meditation. You keep applying that principle to more subtle levels, for the same principle holds all the way through. It's just that, as you keep working on it, it requires more precision. But that's something you can develop. After all, this is a skill. That's another one of the Buddha's great discoveries. The ability to learn the path to liberation is a skill you can master in the same way that you master other skills. Looking at the results of your actions, reflecting back on what you did, and trying to adjust things so that they keep getting more and more precise, more and more subtle, less burdensome to the mind. Awakening isn't something that just drops on people without their being aware of what they're doing. It's not an accident or something that comes from outside. It requires that you get really sensitive to this teaching on Kamma. I am the owner of my actions. You're acting right now, so be very careful about what you do, in the same way that you'd be very careful about building a fire, careful about sharpening a knife, careful about all the other skills you need in life. It's just that, in dealing with the mind, you need to be even more careful, even more precise. It requires more subtlety. But this simple process of just getting more skillful in how you relate to the present moment, that can take you all the way to awakening. And that right there is revolutionary. Proactive people with proactive minds. One of the striking features of the early Buddhist dialogues is the extent to which the Buddha took a personal interest in his listeners. He responded to their questions in a way that showed respect for the fact that they were agents, individuals already acting on their desires for happiness, influencing events within them and around them. Although those desires, in his eyes, were often misguided, he saw that the basic desire for long-term happiness, if it was sincere, should be honored and encouraged. His role as a teacher was to teach his listeners better ways to satisfy that desire. The second dialogue in the Discourse collection, DN2, makes this point in a very pointed way. A king approaches the Buddha with a question: what are the visible fruits of the contemplative life? Before the Buddha answers, the king tells of how he had posed the same question to teachers of other schools, and all had responded, not by addressing the question, but by giving the king a canned version of their doctrines. As he commented, It was as if he had asked about a mango, and they had answered with a jackfruit. The Buddha then gives a long and thorough answer to the king's question, so convincingly that the king declares himself a follower of the Buddha from that day forward for life. And it wasn't only with kings that the Buddha exercised such care and attention. The discourses tell of laborers, lepers, and outcasts to whom he gave the same level of attention with even better results, leading them to awakening. It's important to underline the personal attention that the Buddha gave to his listeners and their sincere desires. Often there is so much emphasis on the impersonal nature of some of his teachings that it seems as if he didn't see people as really real, and that his mission was to persuade them that they didn't exist. His criticisms of craving are often presented in a way that portrays him as an enemy of desire in all its forms. Both of these interpretations miss an important point. The Buddha saw that people were suffering from confused desires and passions. In fact, they were defined by their desires and passions, and that their sufferings were real, SN 23:2, SN 56:27. In response, he felt compassion for them. He realized that one of the best ways to solve the immediate problem of their confusion and sufferings was to teach them to regard events in their own minds in impersonal terms. That way, they could get enough distance from even their most cherished desires to see how confused and counterproductive they were. From that point of view, they could more easily abandon them and replace them with desires more conducive to genuine happiness. So the Buddha never treated his listeners as ciphers or as passive recipients of his teachings. He saw them as people in action. Their sufferings were genuine and had them bewildered, and they were searching for someone to help them put an end both to their bewilderment and to their sufferings, in 663. So he was dealing with people who were already proactively involved in a search, and he wanted to help them find what they were looking for. When he explained the nature of the search for the end of suffering, using both personal and impersonal terms, he would always start with the proactive nature of the mind. This means that when Sariputta opened his explanation of the Buddha's teachings with a mental action, the subduing of desire and passion, he wasn't engaging in a mere rhetorical ploy. He was going straight to the heart of the matter. The power of mental action is the central fact of the Buddha's teachings. That's why the Dhammapada begins by establishing the principle that the state of mind with which you act determines whether you will meet with pleasure or pain. This is the Buddha's distinctive teaching of the principle of karma, kamma in the language of the canon, action in English. Although he recognized three types of kamma, bodily, verbal, and mental, he identified intention, the mental act that aims at doing something, as the determining element in all three. Actions based on unskillful intentions, greed, aversion, or delusion lead to unpleasant results. Now, this doesn't mean that they result in no pleasure at all. The Buddha himself cites cases where people get rewarded for killing, stealing, or lying, etc. SN 42:13. But he would add, the greed, aversion, and delusion underlying these actions are, in and of themselves, unpleasant, and their long-term consequences are going to be painful. On the other hand, actions based on skillful intentions, devoid of greed, aversion, and delusion, lead to pleasant results. Here again, skillful actions might lead to pain in the short term. Think of people who are punished for telling the truth. But the fact that you're acting on skillful intentions is, in and of itself, a pleasant source of self-esteem, and the long-term consequences will be good. Note, though, that this doesn't mean that good intentions necessarily lead to good results. After all, well-meaning intentions can often be based on delusion, which explains the famous observation that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But that road is never paved with skillful ones. Skillful intentions are both good and devoid of delusion. Intentional actions play such a large role in shaping our experience that all 6 of our senses, the 5 physical senses plus the mind's ability to sense ideas, are the result of old Kamma, SN 35-145. However, old Kamma doesn't entirely shape our experience of the present moment. If it did, the Buddha noted, there would be no room for choice in the present moment. We'd be powerless to restrain ourselves from doing unskillful things if old Kamma pushed us in that direction. The idea that something should or shouldn't be done would be meaningless. People would simply do what they were predetermined to do, N 362. But as the Buddha affirmed, the mind can create new Kamma by choosing to act skillfully or unskillfully right now, regardless of what's coming in through the senses, which is why ideas of should and should not have meaning. It's also why it's possible to follow a path of practice that can lead to the end of suffering. So the mind as a recipient of sense data is subject to past Kamma, but the mind as agent, deciding what to do with each moment, isn't necessarily so. It's free to make skillful choices, to act on those choices, and for those choices to make a difference. It's in this way that the Buddha avoids the powerlessness of the 2 extremes of total determinism and total chaos. His view of causality allows for causal relationships and for freedom within those relationships to understand and master causality to direct events to where you want them to go. The Buddha never explains where this freedom comes from, but he does encourage us to take advantage of it for the sake of our long-term welfare and happiness. Intimate causality. After this encouragement, the Buddha would then move the discussion of the power of action from personal to impersonal terms, looking at actions and events in and of themselves, without paying attention to who was doing them or where they were happening. When he did this, his explanations followed the same general outlines as his more personal discussions of actions. The present moment is shaped to some extent by past actions, and to some extent by present actions that have at least the potential to be freely chosen. The difference was that in some cases he framed his more impersonal explanations in terms of general principles, and in others he went in the other direction, going more into the details. The general principles establish the overall framework for how causality works in such a way that it's possible, on the one hand, for actions to have long-term consequences, and on the other, for actions in the present moment to be free from past influences. Only in such a causal system can problems arising from causes be solved by attacking the causes here and now. The more detailed explanations show precisely how desire and passion play a role in giving rise to suffering, and how they can be used to put an end to it. In fact, one of these explanations, called dependent co-arising, will provide the framework for the remainder of this book. As we explore it, we'll see the places in the causal system where intentional action plays a role in giving rise to suffering, the places where desire and passion also play a role, both as conditions for the ignorance that's key to the creation of suffering and as its results, and the ways in which the knowledge that overcomes ignorance allows for intentional actions to fall in line with the triple training that leads to the end of suffering. Exploring both of the Buddha's main impersonal teachings, the general causal principle and its detailed application, allows us to understand the what and why of his teachings. Exploring the ways in which these teachings shape the training that puts an end to suffering helps to explain not only what he taught his listeners to do, but also who he chose to teach and how he trained them. The most important of the Buddha's general formulations of his impersonal explanations of action is a causal principle called that conditionality. This principle gets its name from the fact that all the causal factors it describes are events and actions immediately present to your awareness. This right here, that right there. Instead of pointing to causal factors behind the scenes, it says, in effect, that all you need to know about the causes of suffering for the sake of putting an end to it are things that you can point to in your direct experience as this or that. Keep this fact in mind. When the Buddha describes things in impersonal terms, he's not talking about faraway abstractions. He's focusing on events and actions that can be intimately known, so intimately that they're often overlooked. He's telling you to look closely at what's happening and what you're doing in your immediate experience. As we'll see, these actions and events are even more intimate than the sense of you and your world that you build out of them. The Buddha describes that conditionality with 4 statements that sound very simple on the surface. When this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. Ud 1-3. At first glance, these statements seem to say nothing more than that there are causes that lead to effects, and that every effect coming from a cause that can pass away will also have to pass away. But when you look at the statements more carefully, taking the connected statements in pairs, you see that there are actually 2 slightly different principles interacting. This is what makes that conditionality complex. The first pair is this: when this is, that is. When this isn't, that isn't. This pair describes causality in the present moment. The result appears at the same time that the cause appears. When the cause disappears, the result immediately disappears as well. The second pair describes causality over time. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. The cause may appear and disappear in one time period, but the effect can come and go either right away or much later. An example of the first kind of causality would be putting your finger in a flame. You don't have to wait until your next lifetime to get the result. It burns right away. When you pull it out of the flame, it stops burning. Similarly, if you spit into the wind, it's going to come right back at you and then stop. An example of the second type of causality. You put your finger into a fire and then pull it out. But even though it's out of the fire, it still has the marks of a burn that will take time to heal but ultimately will go away. Another example would be planting a tree seed in a forest. You won't get a mature tree right away. It'll take time, long after you stop the action of planting the seed, and the tree may live for a very long time. But then, because the seed is impermanent, the tree will eventually have to die. The fact that these 2 principles are always acting together means that, at any one moment in time, you will experience a combination of 3 things. 1. The results of various actions that happened in the past, some in the far distant past, others more recently. 2. Your present actions. 3. Some of the results of those present actions. From the point of view of Kamma, this means that your experience is shaped to some extent by past actions, but not totally. It's also shaped by present actions. In fact, as we'll see in the next chapter, without present actions, there can be no experience of the results of past actions at all. The principle of the mind's proactive nature extends that far. Now, 1, because the mind that acts can also be aware of its actions and any immediate results of its actions, and 2, because all the causes and effects you need to know are immediately present to your awareness. Then, the fact that some causes lead to immediate results allows for some very quick feedback loops in the process. In other words, you see the immediate results of your actions, and if they're good, you decide to continue with those actions. If they're bad, you can stop what you're doing. If you put your finger in a fire, then, unless your senses are impaired, you'll feel the pain and immediately pull your finger away. Or if, while meditating, you sense that the way you choose to breathe is making you uncomfortable, you can change mid-breath. However, there are many reasons why we might respond inappropriately to the results of our own actions, making mistakes in interpreting what's causing what. We might be insensitive to what we're doing, or we might not make the connection between an immediate cause and its immediate effect. At the same time, the results of actions in terms of sights, sounds, etc., don't come with labels indicating which actions they come from, whether present, past, or far distant past. In fact, because Kamma seeds don't all sprout at the same rate, it's often the case in any given moment that we're experiencing the results of present actions and past actions that come from many different times and places. This means that many different feedback loops between action, result, awareness, and new actions might all be happening at the same time. This is how that conditionality can get complex and confusing. As a result, we might misread a moment of suffering in the present, thinking that it's coming from something we did in the past, when actually it's a result of something we're doing right now, or vice versa. In either case, we can easily respond inappropriately. Another reason for not seeing the connections between our actions and their results is that our views might prevent us from doing so. We might believe either that no past actions can affect our present experience, or that no present actions can have an effect right now. An example in the canon is of a group of sectarians who believe that all pleasures and pains come from past actions. They practice severe austerities and, because of their beliefs, think that the pain they're feeling comes from burning off old unskillful Kamma, when actually it comes from the austerities themselves. MN 101. And as I noted earlier, some unskillful actions can lead to pleasant sights, sounds, etc. right now, to the point where we desensitize ourselves to the fact that the actions in and of themselves come from uncomfortable mind states. So even though that conditionality focuses on intimate parts of our experience, the fact that we can be ignorant of our most intimate relations with events in our own minds means that we can often abuse those relationships. Every action we make is for the sake of happiness, but many of those actions often end up causing suffering for ourselves and for those around us.